Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Suppliers Who Aren't Ready for Food Traceability, Neither Are Your Systems. I have a couple housekeeping points to mention before we get started. So first, we'll be together for 30 minutes. We are saving time at the end of the presentation for some Q&A. So if you have questions, please enter those in the panel on your screen. And at the conclusion of the webinar, which is being recorded today, you will receive an automatic email with the recording. And if there's colleagues of yours maybe who didn't get to attend today, those videos will be sent to people who couldn't make it as well. So with that, we can go ahead and get started and introduce our speakers.
All right.
Okay, so our first speaker today, Ben Miller, who we are very happy to have back with us. So Ben is the Executive Vice President of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs at the Acheson Group, or TAG. He's an epidemiologist and foodborne outbreak investigation specialist. He's led the state of Minnesota human and animal food regulatory programs and served on the FDA's IFT Task Order 6 pilot project for improving product tracing along the food supply system. His PhD thesis is in the use of critical tracking events and key data elements to improve the traceability of food throughout the supply chain to reduce the burden of foodborne illness. And right now he's working closely with the industry to understand and implement the traceability rule. And we are also joined today by Bruce Christensen. Bruce is the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Product here at ReposiTrak. He comes to us today with more than 20 years of experience throughout the food industry, leading end-to-end business operations, supply chain strategy, marketing, merchandising, and technology. He's served in leadership roles with Fortune 500 private and progressive startup organizations, and his experience includes work with national brands and organizations in retail grocery, and also for companies in the consumer product, consulting, technology, legal cannabis, and food industries. Bruce attended the University of Texas at El Paso, where he graduated with a BA in Business Administration, and he earned dual degrees in Finance and Management. So with that, I will hand it off to our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela.
Great, thanks, Angela.
Oh, let you go for it. Sorry, Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah, no, sorry about that. You can tell we've clearly this is a rehearsed canned program that we're on today, but just a few things we want to cover today, or at least introduce. And Ben's got them up on the screen there. But at a high level, you know, I think all of us on the phone have been through many elements of what we're going to talk about today in bits and pieces, and hopefully what Ben and I are going to be able to share today is some thoughts and ideas about how to piece all of it together. The fact that having information isn't quite enough, and if we don't get ourselves organized, your customers are going to come back at you looking for information in many different formats and many different ways. Data standards and labels are really valuable, really helpful, important approaches in tackling traceability, but labels alone, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, can't be the answer. It's not a good enough answer. It's a hard work answer. And I think Ben will also talk to us for a few minutes about why exemptions are really tricky and really risky.
All right, thanks, Bruce. Yeah, thanks for setting the stage for us in terms of what we're going to cover and talk about today. I like to, or at least I found it's been valuable in doing a lot of these presentations recently, just to kind of revisit why are we even talking about traceability. So in many conversations that I've had recently, you know, I talk with people that really, I think, understand supply chain well, but often the kind of comment that I get is, well, we do recalls great right now. We do recalls perfectly. We've got that under control. So traceability shouldn't be an issue. And I think it's really important to just start from a point of understanding sort of why is this rule, or why did FDA create the rule as it did? So And I've done this work in my past and kind of worked on, you can see in my bio, task order 6 to try to figure out, well, what would a good traceability system look like? We have to remember that the reason for this rule is to allow public health investigators and regulators try to get to the source of an outbreak as quickly as possible. So traceability is really about investigation, whereas recall is really about corrective actions. We've identified that there's a problem with product and we want to remove it from the marketplace as quickly as we can. So put together a little bit of a visual here, and it's a simplistic look, but I think it's helpful in terms of just framing the problem. So in a traceback investigation, we've got multiple people sick across, maybe a bunch of different locations. They could be restaurants, they could be grocery stores. What the investigators are looking for is that point of convergence in the supply chain. Like, where did something come from in terms of a common source that might explain these illnesses? And we compare that to recall. We've got a suspected issue. We've identified a problem with a particular product or maybe lots of products, and we're going to expand typically how much product we're removing from the marketplace. And we're doing that for a variety of reasons because we're not sure that that problem is as limited as we think it is. So we can afford to be less accurate as we trace that product forward through the supply chain. When we think about traceability, data fidelity is really important, or data accuracy, if you will. Whereas in recall, speed is important. Speed's also important in traceability, but you don't get speed if you don't have that data fidelity piece. Now, I think one benefit that we can think about in terms of compliance with the traceability rule is that better data may mean more targeted recalls. We may not have to end up in a situation because we're able to get back to the source in a traceback investigation where we're seeing commodity specific, do not consume advisories like we have seen within the past 5 years. So, there's some benefits that I think get accrued in terms of increasing the data fidelity or data resolution in the supply chain, but we have to really, I think, make this distinction to understand why is the rule written the way it is and why is compliance maybe not quite as straightforward as we think it is. Another way to look at this is just to say, how does this play out in the real world? And really this is a good example of what I would call a traceback diagram. So this is something that investigators generate during the course of an investigation. This actually is an example of a salmonella outbreak that was associated with frozen tuna back in 2014. But in this case, if we look across the top, we've got restaurant locations. So in this case, there were a number of restaurants. Not all are shown on this diagram, but the investigators start at that restaurant level and start to trace back based on records, where product was received in the supply chain. And we try to match those up to people that got sick. When did they get sick? When did they consume product in a restaurant setting? That's the epidemiology component. Trying to trace that back through the supply chain. So you'll see the red boxes around, certain distributors, suppliers, things like that as it moves through the supply chain. This is traditionally how traceback is done. Now, if we overlay the concepts of different CTEs onto this traceback diagram, we start to see, okay, what is compliance with the rule start to look like? And we start to see where some of these critical tracking events start to come into play. And that can happen, in the US, that can happen overseas, depends on what kind of product we're talking about. But where these harvest critical tracking events start to be created, where the shipping critical tracking events start to be created. And the idea is that by having more consistent data capture at particular points in the supply chain, that the public health investigators will get to that point of convergence. In this instance, this moon fishery and this traceback example, get to that point of convergence more quickly. And as I've said before, aren't we already pretty good at recalling product? Yeah, we are, absolutely. But the other thing that we really have to reconcile in our thinking, I think, is, and this diagram comes from GS1 and it talks about case level traceability, but we start at the supplier level, we go through processors, distributors, we ultimately end up at that consumer point of sale. We have designed the supply chain from a data management standpoint to move really in one direction, and that's to go forward. Now we have the Bioterrorism Act of 2002, one step back, one step forward, but that was just in general, who did I receive product from? So this gets to a much more robust set of key data elements, and we have to think about that. We have not designed the supply chain to really function in a backward direction in a really structured manner. And so that again is where some of the the devil's in the details with a lot of these things. Again, remembering that the goal of Rule 204 is to ensure that we're really consistently collecting data at particular points in the supply chain to effect a more rapid and useful traceback investigation. Bruce, I think you've got some thoughts here in terms of these talking points. So I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Ben. And, one thing I did want to circle back around on just a little bit is back on that spaghetti, that bowl of spaghetti from the actual diagram that you shared with us on an earlier slide. Is it accurate? Is my understanding correct about that those tracebacks and investigations can commonly take 4 or 5, 6 weeks? Is that in today's environment? Is that the true look at it?
Yeah, that's a great point, Bruce. They can take that long, especially when we're talking about multi-level. You can see there's multi-levels of distribution throughout the supply chain. In this particular example, that's not atypical for a variety of different products that are going to be on the FTL food list for this rule. So we think about fresh produce, we think about frozen seafood. And the challenge really is, one, it takes time to identify cases, human cases of illness, but once they're identified, it takes a significant amount of time to get and collect that data and sort of start to reconstruct the supply chain in reverse. And so, yeah, it's not uncommon for those investigations to take that long to find a point of.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Yeah, and just picking up on some of those things. The other thing that we find in many discussions, and Ben, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this as well. But we find that people are aware, but becoming aware about the rule. But then when you, to your point, the devil's in the details a little bit, and you start asking the question and looking through systems of do shippers and receivers typically have all that they need to create their KDE records and be able to store them, and kind of talk, if you will, for a minute, Ben, about how much more there is than one forward and one back, and how a shipper or receiver can go about need to think about going about creating their KDE records for investigation and also storage.
Yeah, I think by and large, and if you've looked at the rule, you've probably seen, that your key data elements, you probably have them all already, with the exception of the traceability lot code. I think that's something that's might be new, depending on what point in the process you sit. So if you're, a supplier, or if you're a distributor, in this case, we're talking and focusing on suppliers, if you're conducting a transformation event, you're going to be creating a traceability lot code, but you also need to track all of the inputs into that process. And there's varying levels of maturity within the industry right now in terms of being able to do that, but you probably don't have all this information in one place, or not in one place where you can readily pull those key data elements together in a report. Remember, the agency, if they knock on your door and you're associated with an outbreak or a traceback investigation, you've got 24 hours to provide FDA with that information in a sortable spreadsheet format. So while these data exist, they don't necessarily cohesively exist in an easily accessible manner for a lot of people in the supply chain. The other thing is, we haven't really talked about collectively, I think, as an industry, from the beginning of the supply chain to the end, how are we essentially negotiating the exchange of these key data elements? Because if you sit, at any point other than the very beginning of the supply chain, you have to take in this information from who's ever upstream from you. So you have to have systems set up that can take in that information and take it in probably in a variety of formats, because one thing that the rule doesn't specify is, a defined data standard. We're not all going to be using GS1 in this particular instance. So you have to be able to digest a lot of data in a lot of different formats in order to be able to be compliant with the rule as it's written.
Yeah, Ben, that's a great point in terms of data formats and data capability, and not wanting to get too salesy here, but that is an approach that we've worked really hard to develop, understanding how fragmented the industry still is. There's been just a tremendous amount of gain made over the past several years with GS1, with standards and the development. But to your earlier point about the importance of fidelity and accuracy of data, there's no doubt that standards give a great leg up in the accuracy and availability of that data. But we've also got to be realists and acknowledge and recognize that there's still a lot of room left to grow across the industry, and especially as we look at something like FSMA Rule 204 and the fact that it cuts across multiple departments, multiple categories, in many cases, multiple countries. You get some language barriers in there sometimes as well. And so, our quick pitch is that we do think about providing an easy to use, as nearly fully automated as possible, and certainly affordable approach to this to help customers deal with this important issue.
So let's talk about, I think some of the challenges that are just inherent with compliance. And, Bruce, I think you touched on, there are solutions within, the marketplace that I think can really start to address some of these things. But for me, a lot of it is, where do we start in the process? One is sort of defining, where the gaps are. And so the challenges for implementation really, to me, fall to the fact that we are in a world of case level traceability now. If you read FDA's comments in their publishing of the final rule, they would say, well, maybe not exactly, but I think for all intents and purposes, that's more or less where we are. And so does that affect a change in operations? I think other conversations we've had are like labeling. So does that mean I have to label and track every case through the supply chain? That's one approach. That's a very labor intensive approach. There are, Bruce, you can probably speak in more detail to this, but there are other ways to go about that from a data management standpoint that still ensures compliance with the rule, and I think that does then get into the question around, are your current data management systems set up in a way to identify where the CTEs are happening, what the required KDEs are, and then capture that data in a compliant way. And then, you've touched on, Bruce, here we've got issues around, there aren't data standards that are specified as part of the rule. There's inherently going to be error rates. Those error rates go up anytime you have human handling of product. So the less automated a process is, the more likely that error rate is to increase. And then the question that's always kind of on the table is, do you trace everything, not just FTL foods? I think that is going to depend to some extent on who you are and what you handle. But anytime you create exceptions within your process and say, I'm only going to do this process for these things, I'm going to do this process for these things, we again get into that space of sort of error rate. So I think that's something, when you look at compliance with the rule, it's a fair question to ask. And people may be exempt from the rule as well. There's a whole, we're not going to get into that in this presentation, but there's a whole litany of exemptions. But does that mean that you want to have a bunch of different processes for people that, for your suppliers? Or you're just going to say, hey, we're going to implement CTEs and KDEs across the board because that's going to integrate best within our data systems. Now, maybe you don't track the traceability lot code, but you still require the same set of data and have that same receipt process. So again, to me, the point of why we're talking about this in 2023, even though compliance isn't until 2026, is that it's not necessarily a technology problem, it's a process problem. And so we have to think about all the steps that might need to change in our process and then identify the right tools to solve that problem. And again, it's not really just a food safety problem either. Probably a lot of people that are on this call are, FSQA people. You really need to get, obviously, a multidisciplinary team involved to solve this problem. IT, supply chain, logistics, really across the board, because it's, food safety is a component of it, and in as much as it's FDA compliance driven, but this is going to require, that multidisciplinary approach within a company. So Bruce, I don't know if I can go back to that slide. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that we find coming up in discussions with folks out in the industry, and particularly to the group of suppliers that we're talking about, that we're talking with here today, as you think about a retailer, you think about a wholesaler or distributor that you sell product into, that they have dozens, hundreds, or thousands of customers, and they have dozens to certainly hundreds of suppliers that are affected by the food traceability list. And so as you think about these elements of how many different ways, how many different systems, how much of that, we find that entering into the discussion. And the other thing that comes up, that's beginning to come up a lot more, is a recognition and an acknowledgement of the importance from a food safety standpoint and from a risk management, from a brand equity and a brand value standpoint, the importance of being consistently as close to possible fully compliant with FSMA Rule 204, but also recognize and acknowledge doing this stuff is not required to run your business well every day. And all of you are engaged in hand-to-hand combat every day and trying to get that next level of efficiency. And so you're starting to see a lot of those trade-off discussions happen around how much of this work does one want to do on their own? How much of it do they want to find partners for? And what's the right mix of being both primarily effective, but also do it as efficiently as possible? And that's a tough needle to thread. And to your point about having these conversations in 2023, Ben, those are important decisions for organizations to make. And then once you make that decision, it takes some time to get it all in place. There's the organizational learning, as you've alluded to, that has to take place. There's some process stuff that needs to happen. And then there's whatever level of technology and tracking and training and learning that needs to go along with that. So, we're big believers that now's the right time to get going on it.
Yeah, and I think that kind of just moves into, it's a good segue to, as we think about what tools are needed and when we think about defining these processes, training is a big piece of it. Right now we don't really have training that would sort of be equivalent to PCQI training for traceability. Do we need that? Is FDA going to provide that? I don't think so. So, the reality is there's education that industry needs to do for itself. And I think, this is part of that, but it's certainly not all of it. And then it's looking at how do you map your supply chain internally and externally. I'll have a few example slides that came from an IFT document, and so I think it's making yourself aware of what other resources are out there when you think about defining these processes. So, and then, do we have traceability plan templates like we have food safety plan templates? Again, not yet. Those are in development. That's something TAG is working on for the industry, is coming up with what does a good traceability plan look like, and then do we have good examples of what compliant data sharing might look like? For example, if I use a traceability lot code reference, what would be considered compliant? I think we're going to see more from FDA in terms of examples along those lines, but currently they don't exist. So, I think I know what compliant looks like because I've read the rule and I've certainly done this work for a long time, but those aren't easily answerable questions in some instances. So I would also just highlight that there are a lot of good resources out there. GS1 has a lot of good resources in terms of traceability and ways to think about and approach it, as is IFT, the Global Food Traceability Center. They've certainly been doing a lot of this work for a long time. They've got some good guidance documents. I particularly like that third bulleted one, the guidance document on best practices in food traceability. And we'll have some examples of what that looks like. We're working on a traceability toolkit. So if you go to achesongroup.com traceability, you can download the first chapter of that. The next set of chapters should be available this month in August. And we're also, helping people look at their processes in terms of, like this, how do I start to map out my supply chain? So this is an example that comes from that IFT document that I was just referencing. So understanding, what your supply chain looks like is key to understanding where you're going to receive data from your suppliers from a shipping and receiving CTE standpoint, and then also, where's it going to end up downstream? That's also going to help you identify where you have CTEs in the supply chain, where you have to make sure that you're passing the appropriate KDEs forward. And then I think we look at, within your four walls, and certainly relevant to supplier conversation is much like I would map my process for hazard analysis as part of my food safety plan. How do I start to think about applying that same concept to developing my internal traceability for CTEs and KDEs? So where do I have steps where I need to track receiving? Where are there transformation events, and what kind of key data elements do I need to track through those processes? So that's certainly conversations we're having with our clients right now about like mapping out these processes to get a good sense of where you have to do data capture and what that data capture actually looks like in order to be compliant. So again, what kind of IT tools are available? There's a variety out there. Obviously we're on a webinar here with ReposiTrak, and Bruce can speak eloquently to, how their solution solves a lot of these problems. But really at the end of the day, making sure that data interoperability and the ability to take in information in a variety of formats and be able to handle those variety of formats when you're kind of shipping and moving your data downstream in the supply chain is really going to be important for compliance with this rule. So, just in terms of wrapping it up and what do you need to know, it's like, what's next? How do you know if you're impacted? Are you handling foods on the food traceability list? That should be fairly simple and straightforward, but not always. So, that's obviously a good place to start. And do you need help looking at your processes and figuring out what should be in your traceability plan? And do you have a sense of, what other areas of your business need to be aware that 204 is out there and that they need to be involved? So like legal, supply chain, IT, like we've talked about. So again, we're kind of in the first quarter of the game in 2023, but that game clock's going to move quickly. And I think we're going to be in 2026 pretty fast. And anybody who's ever worked on an IT project or just a data management project knows that, things tend to take longer than anticipated. And so starting some of these conversations now is really the goal of why we're doing these webinars. So we do just a mention of some work that we do. We do have a traceability assessment where you can call us and we walk through on a Zoom call. We'll look at what your potential CTEs and KDEs are at an initial level, and then kind of provide you a written assessment with that. And that can be the starting point of a lot of this process mapping and development that you do. So if that's something that's of potential interest, our email address is at the bottom of the screen there, and it's fairly cost effective at $500 for that initial assessment. So I believe that leaves us a few minutes for questions. Hopefully you picked up a few good tidbits here in our conversation today. So Angela, I can turn it back to you.
Sure, and Ben and Bruce, thank you very much for all that information. We do have a few questions from our group here today. First is, for traceability exercise, what percentage of recovery of FG is considered acceptable for successful exercise, particularly in a bakery setup?
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't really defined a standard like we have in terms of recall. I can say though that, as somebody that conducted traceback investigations, 99, 98, 99%, 100% is really what you'd be looking for, because from an investigation standpoint, what FDA is going to be looking for, state regulators, is the ability to confidently rule in or rule out particular arms of distribution. So, unless that data accuracy and fidelity is pretty high, then you can't do that. And that's sort of what stymied a lot of traceback investigations in the past. For every successful traceback investigation that there's probably been 3 or 4 that have never gotten to a point of convergence. And that's really largely due to the quality of the records in the supply chain. So, Rule 204 is really driven towards that 100% accuracy. Now, are we going to be there all the time? No, but 98, 99%.
And just one more question, and it's really more general about the organic spice industry, and asking for some, I think it's about supply chain management examples, particularly for that part of the industry.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I would say, I know we're right at the top of the hour here, so if whoever put that question out there, if they'd like more specific answer, it certainly can use the email address on the screen here. We can get back to you in short order. So happy to answer that.
Okay, thank you. And I can share that email address with you as well. Well, that brings us to the end of our presentation today. And I want to thank everyone for attending, and thank you to Ben and Bruce. So when we close out today, you will receive a quick survey, and we would very much appreciate if you could provide a response there. And if you don't get a chance when it's up on the screen, then it will be part of that email that you'll get, which will include the recording as well as the slides. So thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thanks, Angela.
Thanks, everybody.
And thanks, everyone.